it's a great pleasure to introduce Alan Reynolds to you today. Now, he's a really prolific author and has written 16 novels so far. Some are thrillers, and he's also written a historical family saga. And I think your latest one has just come out, hasn't it? On
about 2 months ago.
Oh, right, yeah, there you go. And more intriguing, he's also set up a new project set in Tudor times, so that's something to look out for. However, today, as you may have seen from the flyer, rather provocatively, he said, not everybody can write a book, which is again to receive wisdom that everybody's got a book in them. So, I will hand over to Alan, and he can talk about his writing journey and justify that very provocative statement.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I, before I start, can I ask a question? How many of you were at Glastonbury this year? Leeds Fest? You may have seen that what we have to do now, rock stars, we have to do a selfie with the audience. So I've got a camera. You need to have a bit of animation, to show. Enthusiasm is the word. Get ready. You might find this on YouTube later. Hold on. Let's have a look. See how many. Oh, we can get most people in now. Oh, I've got my fingers on it. Ready? Steady. Animation. Yay! And another one. Thank you very much. That's great. Watch that on Twitter later. Thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming along. Special thanks to Books and Beverages for inviting me to speak. Yes, I guess it was a little bit of a controversial statement, but I'll justify it as I go through my discussion today. My name's Alan Reynolds, just checking. Yeah, Alan Reynolds. And I've titled my talk, Everyone's Got a Book in Them. And some people might find that a little bit controversial, but I'll explain my reasons in a moment or two. I'm going to start by giving you a brief background into my writing, how I came about being a writer. I'll also talk a little bit about my latest book, Uncertain Times, and discussing some of the research that I did with that and the first book of the trilogy, comparing 1914 and 1939. So if anybody's interested in history, there's a lot of research that I did, which I'll share some of that with you later. So, a little bit about my background. First of all, I must admitting to be amazed that I'm standing here, or sitting here today, in front of you. I'd never had any ambitions of being a writer. It never even occurred to me. And I'm thinking back when I was at school, 18 years old, and I was forced into English literature, which I wasn't a prolific reader, so it was a bit of a waste. And then we had to study The Winter's Tale. Anyone read that? Probably Shakespeare's worst. And Murder in the Cathedral. Now, I thought this was something with Agatha Christie, but it isn't. It was another boring book, whatever. But anyway, fast forwards 36 years. Of course, I failed English literature and ended up in banking. So I worked my way through, eventually reaching the dizzy heights of senior HR manager, and I took early retirement in 2002. I set up a consultancy, training and development, and I started doing training courses. It started off locally, but then across Europe. I worked in lots of different countries in Europe, including Warsaw, Paris, lots of different ones, and also the Middle East. I did a lot of work with Abu Dhabi, which was great fun. I also spent 6 months working for Centrica, which meant I had to go onto the gas rigs and had to do the survival course. Have you heard about the survival course? Gordon Bennett. They told me when I went there, if you survive, you've passed. That sort of really conjures up the mood. But one of the aspects of this is that you get put in a makeshift helicopter, and it's a massive, great big pool, about 20 feet deep, and they immerse you in this thing, and you've got this rebreather effort on, and then they switch it goes round and round and round, and then you have to get out. That's the survival bit, I think, but it was pretty daunting But having accomplished that, and I remember standing on the deck, the helicopter deck, watching the helicopter coming in to take me back to civilization and thinking, this is a bit different from banking. But I think these experiences that I had, it obviously has given me the opportunity and become sources of inspiration along the way. So let me tell you how it started. In January 2010, if you imagine the kind of job that I was doing, it was cyclical. You know, sometimes I was working a lot, sometimes I wasn't. January 2010, I wasn't, had a free diary. And I don't know why, but I got this idea of a story in my head, and I'll give you some background as to how this story came up. About 1995, I was working up in Newcastle for 3 weeks and staying in a hotel. And I got a buddy up there, and we went out for dinner. And on the way back to the hotel, he related this story to me as we passed those 2 huge tower blocks. Anybody been up there, you can't miss them. You can see them for miles around. Huge big tower blocks in Gateshead. And as we went by, he told me this story, which sort of moved me. It was quite a tragic story. And it was that inspired me into thinking, well, how on earth could that happen? And I was mulling through a sort of a storyline of how I could actually fit this in to a novel. Anyway, I started thinking about, well, who might be in tower blocks at that time? I thought, well, refugees. And then I started getting interested in the Kosovan refugees in 1999. Started doing some research about the Kosovan War, looking at the kind of experiences that happened. I was horrified, absolutely horrified. You know, this pogrom that was happening in Kosovo at the time, and the escapes that they were going through. And I picked up a lot of this information, which started to form part of a story. So with that, I put it together, and 3 weeks later, I'd finished the first draft of Flying with Kites. I have to say, none of the others were that quick, but it was. The story follows Katja, and she's an English teacher, and she's trying to escape from Kosovo with a baby son. And after enduring a really horrific incident, she spent some time in a refugee camp in Macedonia, and actually researched that actual Macedonian refugee camp where she was, including the tents that they were staying in. So a lot of information to say, a lot of this is based on fact. So here she meets another refugee and her 3-year-old daughter, and the story recounts their life in one of the tower blocks. The story is also about the locals who live in the tower blocks as well. It's a love story and tinged with sadness. So, having written the end, the next step was to look for a publisher. I mean, I didn't know whether the book was any good, but I sent a copy. I printed it off, you know, on an ordinary printer. It took me ages, all afternoon, printing this thing off. Anyway, did it, stuck it all together, and I sent it down to my mum, and she loved it. And I thought, that makes all the difference. So I'll skip all the disappointment of the rejection letters, of which there were many. But it was by chance in January 2011, I was introduced to Rick Armstrong of Fisher King Publishing, and the rest, as they say, is history. Flying with Kites was published on August 2011, and it was an event that changed my life. I have to say that. The book continued to get great reviews and was selling very well. In 2013, it won a Wish Yourself Award. And I need to mention here an email I received out of the blue. And it was nobody I knew. It nearly went into junk, but it was signed with someone with a foreign name. And it just said, "Thank you so much for writing about my country." Anyway, I emailed back and so on, and found that she was one of the original refugees that had escaped and set up home in London. I was then invited down to meet several more, and then invited down to speak to about 80 of them in the British Museum with the Albanian ambassador and the Kosovan ambassador. After that, I was invited down to the Houses of Parliament at one of the Independence Days. So I gained a great deal of friendship with the Kosovan community. I did actually do some work in Pristina, and it was completely by accident, if you like, for the Raiffeisen Bank. And one or two of the Kosovan community said, you must contact XYZ. So and I was making contacts of people in Kosovo through London, one of which promised to introduce me to some KLA members, that's Kosovan Liberation Army. That was quite scary. I was put into this car and driven around the back streets. I had no idea where I was going. We ended up in this bar, and there were about 2 or 3 people in there, dark and dismal. I just, crikey, where on earth am I? And you know, they were absolutely brilliant. These guys came in, they spoke reasonably good English, and between us I could get some first-hand experience of what they actually went through, either in fighting or actually staying within Pristina and hiding at the time. So, fast forward again, 2024. I'm just starting my 20th novel as we speak, and 2 screenplays as well. Is there any film producers here? No. Oh, well, if you know of any, let me know. I promised you an extract of Flying with Kites. I pulled a passage. I'll give you a little bit of context of this particular passage. Katia, our heroine, has escaped a dreadful ordeal, and she's still pretty well lost. She doesn't know where she is. She's just come out of a forest. She's got her baby son in a sling, one of these papoose things that's sort of facing her. So that's where we are. So she walked on. Then after another half an hour, she could see she was approaching a village. The anxiety returned. Although she was well away from the site of her earlier ordeal, she was still vulnerable. She had a choice, cut back through the forest or take a chance. She decided to continue. As she got closer, she could see no signs of life. The houses that were still standing looked deserted. The first cottage she came to bore the evidence of war. It had burned out, and bullet holes pockmarked the outside walls in crazy patterns. Melosh, that was her son, started to grizzle again. He'd been so good, asleep most of the time, but he was used to a lot of attention, not being cooped up in the sling for hours on end. When he'd been awake, Katya talked to him, and he seemed to take in the sounds of the forest, woodpeckers hammering for insects, the wind rustling through the trees. It also kept Katya focused. Now it was quiet, very quiet. Even the birds had left this place to its fate. She passed more houses, still no one, more dereliction. Just ahead she could see the road that joined another wider road that came in from the left. Then she saw a familiar sight. Now she recognised where she was. It was Belinche. She had passed through this village a couple of times in the past and remembered she had once stopped at the local general store to buy a sandwich. This must be the main road from Puznik to Pesh, but not as she recalled it. She felt her confidence growing, buoyed by the familiarity, but it still did not ease their plight. Sure enough, as she reached the T-junction, she could see the village store ahead. To the right, the road continued toward Pesh. Like the rest of the village, it had been looted. The front window had been smashed. She reached the buildings and peered in. There were empty cartons and discarded cans everywhere, littering the customer space. The shelves were empty, and the shop door hung at a crazy angle, blocking the entrance. The thought of shelter and a place to rest had drawn her to it, a hidey hole to gather her thoughts and strength until she was ready to move again after dark. It gave her a brief sense of security. She was about to push open the broken door to get inside when suddenly something caught her eye, a movement. She jumped back as a jolt as she had an electric shock. Melosh bounced up and down in a papoose. It was a cat. She stood back as it crawled through the open space of the front of the door. Then the world turned upside down. The force of the explosion knocked Katya off her feet and into the road. Dust and debris clattered around her. She looked down to see if Melosh was all right. He seemed to be none the worse for wear, as she could tell, protected by his covering. As fortune would have it, she'd been blown backwards and not on top of him. Her rucksack had broken the fall. A booby trap. A grenade probably, not enough to kill unless you were standing on top of it, or unless you were a cat, but enough to seriously injure any unsuspecting guest. Unsteadily she got to her feet, thankful for their lucky escape. She checked herself over. She could feel blood trickling from a cut above her eye, caused by flying debris. Otherwise she seemed okay. The wound stung as she dabbed it with the back of her sleeve. She breathed a sigh of relief. It could have been a lot worse. She started shaking. The shock was setting in, but there was no time to wait around. She had to move before someone came and decided to investigate. She walked to the other side of the road with the trees immediately to the background. It was more sheltered, although there was no actual cover, just broken buildings. Given a recent experience, she was not about to seek shelter in one of them. Quickly she pressed on in the direction of Pesh. For a quarter of a mile, still more abandoned cottages dotted the roadside, forlorn like some deserted township from an exhausted gold rush, and then she was out of the village. Another mile or so passed, and more fir trees lined the road, which probably gave her some concealment, and then a deep ravine, probably 100 metres or more, dropped away to her left as a stream cut through the mountains. There was a sharp bend in the road to the right, accommodating the bridge which traversed the water, catch across the maelstrom, which cascaded noisily in the torrent swelled by the melting snow. She turned the corner and froze. A convoy of 3 trucks was heading towards her. It was too late to hide, she'd already been seen. The leading vehicle braked hard and stopped less than a metre in front of her. Catcher was traumatised. Fight, flight or freeze. It had been involuntary. The driver got out and approached her. She didn't recognise the uniform. It wasn't Serb militia or KLA that she could tell. And then she noticed the blue flag and white letters, NATO, painted on the front of the truck. And then she collapsed. Oh. Thank you very much. Read on, as they say. Okay, so back to the plot and why I don't think everybody has a book in them. I was asked this question at a talk I did a couple of years ago, and I thought for a moment and came to the conclusion actually the statement wasn't true. I believe everybody has a story in them, certainly. Putting it together into a cohesive book is a lot more complex, and let me illustrate. I did some research about creative writing a few weeks ago, which I found interesting. I looked up and see what the definition was. Well, there's several, but there's none definitive. All my writing, in my mind, requires a creative process. Creative writing is the art or act of putting your imagination on a page. It's artistic expression in words. But what does this mean in practice? Well, this is my take on it. I believe there are 3 key components to creative writing. Firstly, there's the inspiration for a story, then the development of a plot, and then the development of characters. Now, I'll start with inspiration for a moment, and this is often what holds people back. Many aspiring authors just don't know what to write about. I see this on Facebook. I'm a member of several different writing groups on Facebook, and often you get posts and people say, well, I've got this idea, but I don't know where to start. And I won't bore you with some of the replies they get. They're not very helpful. But this is the first part, is actually making that first step to actually putting pen to paper, or in my cases, fingers to keyboards. In truth, an idea of a story, of course, can come from anywhere. I've given you the details of my idea for flying with kites. I'll give you another one I did. There's one there called The Tinker, which is one of my favourite. I was going down to Bristol, and it was a trip I'd made many, many times. I was getting bored with the M5, so I decided to go around the A46, which is a lot more picturesque, and came to this village called Painswick. Painswick is famous for its church and the graveyard, which has 99 yew trees planted in. And apparently legend has it that if someone was to plant number 100, the devil will come and dig it up. So there we are. Anyway, I was sat there having a coffee in one of the cafes there, and I just had this vision of this guy on a push bike and pulling behind him a little cart with all his worldly goods in, and tent and everything else. And it suddenly came to me, I wonder what his story is. What's he doing? And that's where the Tinker came from. Okay, so plot development. Well, obviously plot is essential. Now, I don't know how, there's many authors here, how you do it. I do use mind maps. I didn't with Flying with Kites because it started off like a long essay. But now I do. I use mind maps, and it's brilliant for keeping track of your characters, and every chapter I start a new mind map. My chapters, again, this is often asked the question, how long should a chapter be? Now I use between 4,500 to 5,000 words, and I do have a reason behind that, because it's around about the time someone, if you're laying in bed reading a book and you want to read a chapter before you put the light out, that's about the right number that you do. So there is some logic in that, and that's what I use. Having said that, often I start an idea for a story and it takes a mind of its own. It really does do that, it gathers ideas, and more ideas. As I do research, I get more ideas, and that comes along. The third element I talked about was character development. Now, this is more than just saying, well, they've got brown hair, dark eyes, but thinking about their personality. Initially, this was also interesting, I found I was creating characters in my own image. And apparently this is quite common. I found it difficult to write the F word, even when it was warranted. I mean, funny enough, if you read Flying with Kites, I actually write F-O-O-K. Because that's the Geordie pronunciation, to my mind. I have to say, I have no inhibitions now. I found out to be a writer, you need to be an actor in a way. You have to get into the mindset of your characters, and this is something I've really learned as I've gone along. And so if you're creating a dialogue, it must be a dialogue that the character would actually use, not one that you personally might use. Okay, let's give you, as I said, I've just started a new project, which is set in Tudor times in 1530. I just thought I'd give you an idea of how I do it. This is a description of George Talbot, who was the 4th Earl of Shrewsbury. He was a much favoured lord in the king's court. He was godfather to the previous king's daughter, Margaret, and continued good patronage with Henry VIII. He'd fought bravely in battle, earning him rewards and positions of power. He was a supporter of the king, was a signature to the letter to the Pope, urging him to grant the king a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He was now elderly in his 60s. He dressed the part of a man of wealth, silk shirt, doublet and hose, a white ruff and extravagant hat complete with feather. As well as a portly belly, his age gave him pronounced eyebrows, a round, ruddy face with sparkling eyes. He was known for his stentorian voice, which would boom out across the debating chamber. He would always be heard. So I'm trying to paint a picture in words, gives you an idea. So, okay, you've written your 80,000 words and written in those immortal words, the end. It's a very gratifying process. But of course, that's not the end of the writing process. I always enjoy the first full read-through after I've finished the book. Only then will you get an idea of the flow. Often I have to make a tweak in the odd character as they've developed across the book. Checking for continuity issues, hair colour, eyes, they can change. Then comes the editing. Now, it's a necessary but time-consuming task. Firstly, if you're using Word as a process, the spell checker is very good. It's a good place to start, and it also helps with the grammar. One I'll just mention, you do have some of the pesky words that escape, things like thought, through, and though. It's easy to miss those because it won't be picked up by a spell checker. You can, of course, pay for a proofreader editor, but they're pretty expensive. And if you're receiving less than £1 a book, when it comes to royalties, it represents a huge number of sales. Research suggests that 90% of all books sell less than 500 copies, so that's a sobering thought. So as I say, in my opinion, I don't think everybody does have a book in them. Okay, I want to move on and talk a little bit about my latest book, Uncertain Times. I like setting myself challenges when it comes to writing, and during lockdown I wanted to try something different and embarked on my first historical novel. I soon discovered there were different challenges to writing historical novels. The Baker story, which is the first of the trilogy, required extensive research, not just in historical facts, but things like clothing and dialogue. I mean, how did they speak in 1914 Yorkshire? As an example, and you might find this useful, I discovered that the word okay, which is the most common word in the English language, it didn't actually appear in English literature until 1922. So in 1914, it's no use saying, how are you? I'm okay, would not have worked. It did come popular. The popularity actually happened and started in the 1940s when it was down to the films that were being on the screens at the time. And of course, we had lots of Americans actually in the UK at that time. So the baker's story is set in Keighley in 1914 and starts the day before the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the heir presumptive to the Austrian-Hungary throne. Interestingly, the event was not significantly covered in the newspapers in the UK. It was confined to a footnote in the Times. The story revolves around a baker, Arthur Marsden and his family. I deliberately wanted to concentrate on the working class rather than the sort of Downton Abbey and the aristocracy at the time. I did take a few liberties with Keighley, and I did a talk with the Keighley History Society, and they were horrified. But anyway, that's all right. As part of my research, I was able to get access to the Keighley News and also the Times from June to September 1914. So that was a period covered by the book. So events that take place in the town, things like what was on at the cinema and so on, are actually accurate. Now, early in the book, world events are not an interest to Arthur Marsden. He was more concerned where his next delivery of flour was coming from and what was on at the local cinema. He was out and out socialist and cared passionately for the foundrymen and their struggles for better conditions. He joined the newly formed Labour Party. At that time, they had 4 MPs. So how did the average working person become aware of the threat of war? Well, flour at the bakery is delivered on a daily basis, and the first sign that things were not right was the continual increase in the price of flour and the reduction of availability, which the wholesaler blamed on the government. Arthur thought that the government was stockpiling flour and selling it to Russians at a profit. This was at a time when bread was sold by the ounce. Let that sink in for a minute. There was no radio in 1914, and newspapers were the prime source of news, and it was not until early July when the Times started to comment on the different political allegiances which were evolving in Europe, which would spark the possibility of armed conflict. So as tensions increased, so the call went out for volunteers to join the army. You might remember Earl Haig and his big poster, "Your country needs you." As a baker, Arthur was excused from armed service as he was in a reserved occupation. However, certain events happen in the book which saw him being drafted into the army, and the book ends with the week after the outbreak of war with Arthur marching off. The second book, Arthur's War, as a clue in the title, follows his experiences in the war, immersed in the horrors of trench warfare. Arthur's sister Grace joins the Fannies, that's the first aid nursing yeomanry, while his sister Agnes becomes a singing star. Final one of the trilogy, The Last Poppy, it concludes the trilogy, and it takes the story to 1918, but there was a specific mention about how the military treated soldiers with shell shock. Again, it's all accurate, but it's quite horrific in places. So what was it like in Keighley in 1914? I'll give you some highlights of research. It was an industrial town with 52 woolen mills and a foundry in the area. It was a time of significant industrial unrest. There was a lengthy strike in the spring of 1914 with little in the way of union support. The workers were literally starved into returning to work. There was poor quality of water at that time, and this is true, that men actually drank beer to avoid stomach upsets. This, of course, led to drunkenness. So they'd have several pints of beer before going to work. Street lighting was predominantly gas. Cinemas, silent films were starting to become a leisure pastime. The flat above the bakery, which was home to a family of 7, had no running water. They used a pump. There was no toilet or electricity. They cooked on a coal-fire range. Baths were traditionally once a week in a tin bath. Horses were still prominent, although motorised transport was becoming more widely available. Keighley at that time had 8 trolley buses, and they were weird looking vehicles. I actually managed to get a picture of one from 1914. It was open, and next to the driver was this sort of big tube. It was like an umbilical cord which went up to the pantograph, which was like an upside down coat hanger. And so that's all described in the book. There were significant queues at the bakery and butchers. Rationing didn't actually start till 1916. Now, after the outbreak of war, potato flour was widely used in the making of bread. Allegedly, it was awful, and it was purgative, apparently. The suffragette movement was making its presence felt with regular meetings and demonstrations. Several women were imprisoned and went on hunger strike, but in a deal with the government, Emmeline Pankhurst called off their programme of civil disobedience in exchange for the release of political prisoners. In the country as a whole, the recognition of the possibility of war didn't really happen until about a month before the conflict started. So on to Uncertain Times, which is the latest one that's out. So following the success of the Marsden trilogy, I was constantly asked for what happened to the family. So I wrote the book to follow the next generation, and it started to the run-up of the Second World War, which is a nice comparison. So again, I did a great deal of research, and I thought I'd give some background from this research of what the social climate was like at the time and compare it with 1914. Before I go any further, there's a quote from Albert Einstein that says, "You cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war." In 1939, Britain was certainly guilty of ignoring this truism. Germany had already started rearming as soon as Hitler had come to power in 1933, despite being banned by the Treaty of Versailles, and rearmament was responsible for a large extent to the rise in economic growth and the rise of the Nazis in Germany during that time, due to the number of jobs it created. The overtures from Chamberlain and Lord Halifax under the policy of appeasement, which culminated in the Munich Agreement in 1938, was no more than a stalling tactic by Hitler. He was hell-bent on taking back the territory that it had lost during the armistice of the First World War. Interestingly, in some figures I found, defence spending in Britain had gone down from £766 million in 1919 to 1920 to 102 million in 1932. Now, the UK did respond with a substantial programme of rearming between 1934 and 1939, but compared with Germany, it was no more than a catch-up. So, Uncertain Times starts in January 1939, and we're back in Keighley. The bakery is now under the management of Arthur's eldest son, William. And what do we notice? Well, there's no shortage of flour or other ingredients in making bread. Queues were a thing of the past. In the bakery, living conditions were much improved with running water, indoor toilet, electricity, a gas range. Outside, there was better street lighting. There were still trolley buses, but they were a lot more comfortable and reliable, and there were very little horse-drawn traffic. Across the UK, generally, living standards, particularly healthcare, had improved significantly since 1914. Tuberculosis and Spanish flu had all been but wiped out. But interestingly, there was an increase in lung cancer since 1900, where it was virtually unheard of, and we know this was obviously the advent of smoking, which at that time they hadn't joined the dots and made the connection. On the political front, interestingly, and I didn't know this when I started writing, that there were problems in Ireland. It was still on the agenda. The IRA actually declared war on Britain on January the 15th and started a bombing campaign. It wasn't quite on the par with the 1970s, but it still caused casualties and went on for over 12 months. The plight of the Jews in Germany was not generally appreciated. Although Britain did take in 10,000 Jewish children in a programme called the Kindertransport between November 38 and September 1939, but these was the result of children's charities and the Catholic Church, not government-sponsored. In fact, there was an embargo on Jewish asylum seekers by the British government, fearing that the UK would get overwhelmed. It's an interesting one. In my assessment, the significant difference between 1914 and 1939 was communication, primarily due to the advent of radio and the increase in cinema attendances. Most houses in Britain had one or access to a radio. Cinemas were packed. Now, some of those you might be able to go back a while can remember Pathé News. Do you remember Pathé News? This was a very popular part of the programme. You always had this Pathé News. It went on for about 10 minutes, and it was a snapshot of recent news. Now, this is where the government was clever. They did a lot of management of the propaganda through the Pathé News because they knew that millions every week were actually watching this. And they're on YouTube, by the way. I watched several, and it's fascinating. Listen, incredibly jingoistic. The guy who speaks has got such a posh voice, it is just amazing. But there's one particular, I remember, the King was inspecting the fleet at Portsmouth of about 120 warships in the harbour, and all this was fed in that the French and the British Navy was far bigger and far more than a match from the Germans. So it was all of this very positive information was coming through. But there were indications of a preparation for war. Now, I didn't know this again, that barrage balloons actually started to appear in London in late 1938, so quite a while before war was started. It was marketed as a sensible precaution by a responsible government. We heard that before. But there's no doubt that it did scare a lot of the population of London. Gas masks were started to be distributed in January 1939. 35 million were eventually distributed. Anderson shelters were being distributed in some London boroughs as early as February 1939, and the first one was in Islington. And so people were generally more prepared, albeit by whatever bias the government wanted to spin at that time. Difference in 1914, I guess, there was a more jingoistic approach to war. Soldiers were being cheered through the streets, and the great belief was that it would be over before Christmas. So one final point before I close. Was war inevitable in 1939? In my mind, the tipping point, if you like, the key moment was on March the 15th, when Germany marched into Czechoslovakia. This was a humiliation for Chamberlain and his attempt at appeasement via the Munich Agreement. He once stated that Hitler was a man with whom he could do business. It showed that Hitler couldn't be trusted, and there's a radio broadcast which I actually listened to. Chamberlain actually spoke about this and felt betrayed. It resulted in a mutual assistance pact. This was the crucial point between Britain, France and Poland on April the 6th. So once that had been signed, the rest, as they say, is history. So the title Uncertain Times is a fair reflection of that era. There we are. I hope you found the talk interesting. I still believe that everybody doesn't have a book in them. Everybody has a story. So it concludes my talk. So over to questions and answers. I'm happy to take, if we're all right for time. Yes?
How long does it take you to write?
Now, that's a brilliant question, and it varies significantly. When I was actually doing my training, I haven't done any training since the pandemic, by the way, so I've been concentrating for the last 4 years on writing, and I can really just sit down and concentrate. My first book, as I said, was 3 weeks to get to the first draft stage. There was a lot of editing that went on after that. I would say somewhere between 3-5 months. Depends. The new one I'm doing now, and certainly the trilogies, required such a lot of research. You know, at the moment, I'm actually having to look at whole lines and whether or not that is the kind of language that they would use in 1533. So it really depends on the amount of research that I have to do. Sometimes I can go a day just doing nothing but research, and I don't have pen to paper, with fingers to keyboards. I do take a notepad to bed. I don't know if any other people find this, that it's surprising if you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning how creative you can be. And funny enough, flying with kites, I remember writing for about an hour and a half non-stop. It just absolutely flowed. So in answer to the question, it has varied quite considerably.
Do you do most of your research before you start the book when you've got a story, or do you just carry on researching as you go along through?
It tends to be a continual process. I mean, with the one I'm writing at the moment, because I needed to get a lot of information about, I know what the story's going to be, because it's a fictional account of what actually has happened. So I needed to get as much background as possible. The interesting thing from the research that I've done is there is no consistency in the actual story that I'm writing. So I'm trying to put together what might be a consistent approach to quite a wide range, but I'm having to also research as I'm going along little silly things, you know, just as I say, what people were wearing, what the houses were like. You know, here's the thing, they didn't have chimneys. Now, you think, well, why should that make a difference? You imagine being a house without a chimney. So you stoke up the fire and you've got your pot on there, and what happens to the room? It's smoke, you know, they can hardly see across it. And that's true, that there was lines, you know, the smoke was across, and people were choking. You know, nice to get a good meal. So they're choking, so all this smoke comes out, it's got to get out of here, let's go down the ale house.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Very much. Sorry.
No, it's,
I was just going to ask how much difference search engines on computer made in terms of your research. And how much you trust stories the source material?
I use Google pretty well all the time, but it's surprising what you can find. I'll give you an example. The book Exfil there, which again I'm really, really proud of. This is about a nuclear scientist from Iran who wants to escape out of Tehran. And I wanted to know about the Iranian secret police. And strange enough, they're quite secret. It's true. I managed to find, now you Google, then you've got links, and you Google again, you search, and I eventually ended up with this PDF. And it was the State Department, and it had secret on it, and then somebody had crossed out the word secret, but it had a whole dialogue, 64 pages this was, about the Iranian secret police, where the structure, who was who, and so on. And that was brilliant for me. I mean, I was just going, hey, we'll have some of that, sort of writing it down. So again, the factual accuracy of events that happen in there are all based on real circumstances. But as I say, thank you, Mr. Google. How on earth Charles Dickens did it, I have no idea. Sorry.
Thank you. No,
yes.
thank you. Very much enjoyed your books and your insights into that as well. You mentioned about the inspiration.
Yes.
There's always got a story in them. Personally, do you always have an end to your story, or does that come in an organic?
It sometimes changes.
Does it?
I mean, Flying with Kites, I knew exactly where I was going to end. And this was a different book in some respects because the incident that my buddy told me about comes at the end. So I had to sort of work my way up to that. And the one I'm writing at the moment is very similar. I know how it's going to end, but I have no idea how I'm going to get there. So I'm adding bits and pieces, and I'm thinking, oh, that's 20,000 words, how many more words do I need? And thinking of more storylines to fill the gaps, if you like, until I get to the end. Certainly, there's several, the 112 there, that certainly didn't end as I thought it was going to end. It was even better than I thought it was going to end. But so it really changes, The Pendle Cottage is an interesting one. It's my first and only supernatural one. And what I didn't realise at the time, the actual cottage is based on my grandparents' cottage. When I was growing up, I was little, well, it was, yeah, all fair. Anyway, I was growing up. My grandfather was a village blacksmith. There's a little tiny village near Craven Arms in Shropshire. And they had this wonderful thatched cottage. Well, they had the end cottage, the other two belonged to other people. And this dated back to the 13th century. It was apparently at one stage the rectory from the church. It's quite close to the church. Now, at the back of the garden was a graveyard. And when I was little, that was scary because we had no electricity and it was outside toilets. We used to have to walk up the garden path. There was a big sycamore tree, and on the left-hand side was the pigsty. And the other side of the pigsty was the toilet, and at the toilet came wooden holes. Well, not wooden holes, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Anyway, and you'd be there, and you could hear the pig grunt to the way next. Now, actually, I didn't know this at the time because I was writing this, and I got this vision in my mind. And as I wrote it, I finished it. That was my grandparents' cottage. Yeah. So Pendle Cottage, actually, the grounds and everything became the inspiration for a book. So you never know where it's going to come from. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why you chose Keighley as for the trilogy.
Sorry.
Why you chose Keighley as the title?
It's a very good question. I wanted it was fairly random. I wanted a sort of a typically, I hate to use the word working class, but an industrial town. You know, so it ticked all the boxes. Again, this was just in my imagination, and it fitted. I talk about James Street. That isn't James Street. There's no James Street. It's based on Connaught Street, the long street. I put a road halfway along, and on that corner is the bakery. Again, Keighley History Society didn't like that. But, and opposite was a bank, you know. Well, in my mind, it's real. I'm happy with that. But it suited the story. And just down the road is the pub. And Arthur's a regular visitor to the pub. So it ticked all the boxes. The other thing is about the social climate at the time. Anybody who's interested in social history will get a lot from it because there's so much information on there and it's all factually accurate. It's a fictional book, but it's factually accurate. Thank you.
Can I ask you another question?
Yes, of course.
You know when you talked about the place you stopped with the yew trees on your diversion of your nice route to Bristol?
Oh, yes,
I
yes.
can't remember the name of it.
Painswick.
Yeah, and you said you had a vision. Was that something you saw or was it in your head?
It was in my head.
Right.
No, that's a very good point. I've often thought about this since. In fact, that is Painswick Church from a picture that I took at the time. But it was very much a vision. It just, I don't know why and where it comes from, but I just had this idea of this guy on a peddling and what on earth was his story. And it's a tragic story. It's an interesting story. I based it in 1986. The tinker's name is Michael, and he visits the village. I've changed the name of the village every year since 1979, and he does odd jobs. He stays through the summer and he services boilers, and he can put his hand on almost anything, lawns, gardens, all that kind of stuff. The locals love him, but they only know him as Michael, and he stays with the vicar and his wife. They've got an annex there, which he uses and lives there during the summer. And 1986, the backstory starts. An incident happens and the backstory starts coming through. So we start understanding his background and what happens. And that's quite fascinating. And again, a lot of research that took place in that. Thank you very much.
Well, everybody, can I just say thank you very much to Alan?
Great pleasure. Thank you.